This podcast is powered by MIDA, the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility. Find out more about MIDA on their website, mida.umd.edu.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ron Padron, and I am the Director of Academic Involvement for the Including Disability Global Summit, or IDGS for short, as well as an Associate Editor for the companion journal, Including Disability. And welcome to another edition of the IDGS podcast, powered by MIDA, the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility. And you can learn more about MIDA at mida.umd.edu. And joining me today is Dom Kelly, the co-founder, president, and CEO of New Disabled South and New Disabled South Rising. He's been organizing since 2009, committed to building a progressive future for disabled people in the Southern U.S. And he previously served as a senior advisor for Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial campaign, as well as a lead fundraiser and advisor for her voting rights organization, Fair Fight Action. So welcome, Don. I am very happy to have you on the pod.
I'm so excited to chat with you.
Yeah. So for folks who may not know you, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and more about New Disabled South?
Sure. Yeah. So I have been in the ecosystem of disability awareness, inclusion, rights, justice since I was about 4 years old. I'm a triplet, and my brothers and I were diagnosed with cerebral palsy when we were a year old, and my mom became an advocate and kind of threw us into advocacy as well, and started public speaking when we were 4, and just this kind of became something that I did and that I wanted to do with my life. And so over the years of being in different movement spaces and organizing, and I had a career in music and doing this work a little bit in music spaces and stuff, I just really started to realize that I wanted to be in movement work full time. And so that eventually, after some jobs in voting rights and political strategy and campaigns, and I found myself really wanting to have a Southern strategy for disability rights and justice organizing, and realizing that there wasn't a regional approach to this work in the U.S. at all. So that was what kind of led me to start New Disabled South, really as a way to break our really phenomenal advocates and organizers and organizations out of their silos in each of the states in the South, and just create a space for folks to work together, share resources, strategy. And then from there, just sort of evolved into all the things we do, which is, policy and legislative work. We do grassroots organizing, original research, and some narrative change work as well. And we have our 501c4 arm, New Disabled South Rising, and we can do a little bit more partisan work through the C4. And we've just grown in the last, this is our third year, and we just hit 20 staff, and we're continuing to grow and expand our reach, and continuing to try to build power for disabled folks in the South.
Can you share maybe 1 or 2 projects that y'all are currently focusing on right now?
Yeah, for sure. We're continuing to work on our and build out our plain language policy dashboard, which is a tool that we built that translates state and local legislation bills into plain language. And that's been, really exciting project that, like I said, we're continuing to grow and build on. And then this year, I'm really excited about, we just launched our Black Disability Institute, which lives in our research department. Our data and research director, Kiana Jackson, came up with the idea with Casey Amon Wilson, who's my co-founder and COO, and really as a way to be able to focus a lot of the research on just the intersection of Black identity and disability identity, and and Dr. Sammy Shock is actually a senior fellow while she's on sabbatical. Now through I think like May of 2026. So she's kind of housing her research in, we call it BDI. So I'm super excited about that. We're working on this anthology and storytelling and writing initiative under BDI as like a starting point, and that's been really exciting too.
That's amazing. I love storytelling approaches to advocacy and activism. So I love that that's part of what you're doing.
Yeah.
So I specifically asked you to come onto the pod to talk about Section 504. For folks who may not know what Section 504 is, and it's interesting that you talked about like the plain language dashboard too, because so much of what disabled folks, what we have to navigate is just layers and layers of legalese and policy. So for folks who may not know what Section 504 is, or maybe because it's been in the news recently, have taken a look at it, but don't understand what the legalese policy language is, can you talk a little bit or explain about what Section 504 is?
Sure. So Section 504 refers to, or 504 refers to the section of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 that basically protects disabled folks from discrimination based on their disability. So the law, while the Rehabilitation Act was a thing in 1973. Section 504 wasn't signed into law until 1977, I believe. And this particular section made it clear that any entity, any service that receives federal funding cannot discriminate. So has to be accessible. The big thing back then was making sure that like there were accessible buses and public transportation, for example, if they receive federal funding. In schools, a lot of folks know about 504 plans in schools. That is that's a direct result of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act being signed and implemented, which was itself because of some really incredible organizing that disability rights activists did. Anyone seen Crip Camp? Netflix, and Judy Heumann kind of leading the charge post, the camp that she and other activists were a part of, leading the charge to advocate for 504, and they had the largest or longest lasting sit-in of a federal government building in history to this day. It took over a federal building in San Francisco for, I think, nearly a month, and were able to force Section 504 to be signed into law. So, in the simplest way to explain 504 is that it ensures that disabled people cannot be discriminated against when in regards to entities, services that receive federal funding.
Yeah, thanks for that. And so I think a lot of folks, when they think about how disabled folks are protected in the U.S., they think about the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. Section 504 predates that by 15, 20 years. But Section 504 really is kind of what laid the foundation for the ADA to eventually come later. Can you talk about a little bit because I think sometimes people conflate the different laws or policies that protect us.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how the ADA is different from Section 504?
Yeah, for sure. So, first and foremost, like Section 504 is specific to preventing discrimination against folks who disabled folks who in like activities, programs, services that receive federal funding. Whereas the Americans with Disabilities Act is the law that prohibits discrimination, period, in public life. That's employment, that's education, accommodations. That's like, if I go to a building and it's inaccessible, I have the grounds to, make a complaint, file a lawsuit for violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So Section 504 is usually applies mostly to like schools, healthcare providers like hospitals and stuff like that. Again, like programs, entities that receive federal funds. And then there's, enforcement that is led by um, Health and Human Services, the Office for Civil Rights, OCR, and and then the ADA. Again, that's just like any and all public life prevents discrimination, makes it so that if you need the language is reasonable accommodations at your job, for example, you know have your employer should be able to provide that, or that would be considered um, you know uh, discrimination. So um, 504 is more specific to the funding, what the program is tied to, which is a big part of why this lawsuit is happening, because the states don't want to be told what to do with this money.
Yeah. Um, so before we get to the lawsuit, one of the things that I find like really interesting, funny, sad, I don't know how, depending on the day, is how I feel about it, but one of the things that Section 504 allowed when lobbying for the ADA was when folks were lobbying for Section 504, one of the arguments against it was that it would be economically crippling, that well, businesses or schools, or the impacts it would have on the economy, as if just like, oh, if we had to care about disabled folks, then it would cost money, as if that was to them a valid argument, but they were able to use that when that didn't happen as a result of Section 504. They were able to use that to kind of take away a big potential argument against the ADA. They still tried to make that argument with the ADA against passing the ADA, but they were able to point to the last 15 or so years previous of Section 504 to be like, well, you said it was going to happen with that too, and it didn't. So next, please. You mentioned lawsuits. So at the time of this recording, 17 states, led by Texas, surprise, have filed a lawsuit seeking to declare Section 504 unconstitutional. The case is Texas v. Becerra, and it's currently stayed. The lawsuit is, in theory, a response to updates to Section 504 that were enacted under the Biden administration. But the plaintiffs are going well beyond just asking for those changes to be rescinded to just ruling the entire thing unconstitutional. So can you talk a little bit about the impact that would have on the disabled community if that was to succeed, especially given all the other attacks that are coming that are aimed at the disabled community or will impact the disabled community under this second Trump administration?
Sure. Yeah. So I will say that the attorneys general are all claiming that they're not trying to deem the entirety of 504 unconstitutional, even though that's like literally what the language says twice, I believe. And so, I mean, this would have an enormous impact. One, like if it's deemed unconstitutional, schools would no longer have to provide 504 plans to students in school. And also there would be no enforcement if students don't have, or do not have their accommodations met that they need. Healthcare providers, doctors, hospitals wouldn't have to provide adaptive equipment to disabled people, or sign language interpreters to deaf or hard of hearing folks in doctors' offices or otherwise, or in school. Websites for schools, hospitals, providers won't have to be accessible for folks who are blind or low vision. Uh, I mean, the list kind of goes on of like the entities that receive that kind of funding will know there will no longer be enforcement um, for being having to provide that type of access. So like it'll deeply impact our community at large. But I think the maybe the scariest part of that is that the ADA was came about because of 504. And the legal thinking as of now is that if 504 is done away with, that opens the door for them to overturn the ADA, which, like you said, I mean, they've been wanting that since the beginning. The big corporations especially have been, I mean, hate the ADA. It's money they have to spend, and so this has been like a long term, decades long, attempt to overturn these laws that make it so that that public, private, um, government entities don't have to can't legally discriminate against our community. So, yeah, in the immediate, it would completely do away with those protections under the section of the Rehab Act, and then long term, it will very likely lead to trying to overturn the ADA.
Yeah. You mentioned that the plaintiffs, the attorneys generals, are saying that they're not trying to rule it unconstitutional, even though it's literally written in their desired outcomes. It's like the fifth or fourth bullet in what they're attempting to do. We'll include a link to the actual filing motion, or whatever you call it, in the show notes, so that folks can see that they wrote it down, that they want it ruled unconstitutional, even though they're saying that no, that's not what we want. So you mentioned earlier, I want to kind of drill down and maybe give folks like a really hyper specific example. So obviously this administration kind of came in writing a manufactured wave on anti-DEI, talking about, just lying about what DEI work is. And then they like to say DEI, but when you read all of the stuff they're doing, they like to pen that A onto there for accessibility. And so currently, they just confirmed the new Secretary of Education, and they're in the process of attempting to dismantle the Department of Education. Can you talk about the intersection of Section 504 and education, the Department of Education? You alluded to 504 plans before. Can you maybe let's drill down on, like, what does that look like? What does that mean? How does that support disabled students? And what are we at risk of losing if they're successful in overturning 504?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're at risk of losing our students' ability to have accommodations and access in a school environment. And it's not just 504. If the Department of Education is dismantled and gutted, there's no um, there's no enforcement for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which, like, students who have IEPs, individualized education plans, like, if that is enforced and directed by the Department of Education, and that is the goal. I mean, if you read Project 2025, it literally talks about the education being left to the states. And I mean, I can talk about southern states. I don't, I'm not entirely sure about our other states in the rest of the country, but in the South here, I wouldn't trust our states to run education for a second. I mean, our schools are so completely underfunded here, our public schools, and every legislative session in most of our states, there's tons of money given to private school vouchers, and private schools can legally discriminate against disabled students because they're not forced to adhere to IDEA. So, like, I don't trust for a second that the states will then have to use, the money that they're required to use to make sure that students have IEPs and that those IEPs are enforced and 504 plans are enforced. And basically there's just no enforcement. And so I mean, like, the connection, of course, is like, you do away with 504. I mean, actually, either way, maybe the Department of Education is coming first. I'm not sure, like, timeline wise, what's going to happen first. But, like, either way, it completely dismantles protections for students in school, and it completely does away with any sort of ability to enforce these laws to ensure that there's oversight over how and where money is being spent. And like, I don't, who knows where parents can go to, be able to go and say, hey, like, my kid was discriminated against in school. And like, usually you can go to OCR at the Department of Education and like file a complaint. But like, if that's gone, I think they talked about maybe moving it to the Department of Justice, but like, it's just not exactly clear. And so it just does away with any kind of enforcement. And it would just be detrimental to disabled students.
Mm-hmm. And this is so to provide some additional context to the OCR within the Department of Education. At the start of the Trump term, they were told to pause all investigation or litigation into any claims or complaints of discrimination. And I forgot the exact number, but it's in the thousands of how many there were ongoing. And they were told to pause those, not accept any new ones. But of the ones that they paused, just over half of them are disability related discrimination cases.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah. One can I add one thing about 504 that I think like
absolutely, yeah.
I forgot to bring up earlier, but I think it keeps getting missed in like a lot of the coverage I've seen and what folks are talking about. So like there was an update on the lawsuit, and again, the attorneys generals were like clarifying their stance, and they were only going after the language around gender dysphoria, and but again, still says unconstitutional as a whole. But there's a portion of what they are also like fighting against that's not just about the updated regulations around gender dysphoria, but a big piece of the updated regulations was this language around the most integrated setting. So the rule regulation update, I think it was like around a year ago, it was in 2024, incorporated Olmstead protection. So like that most integrated setting requires protections for disabled folks who are the language is at serious risk of institutionalization. And they have specifically said that they believe that that's unconstitutional as well. That they don't want to have to use the money to make sure that folks are in community settings rather than institutional settings. So like this is motivated by transphobia, like specifically and directly, and they are going after Olmstead. Essentially, they don't fundamentally do not believe that disabled people should be in community settings, and they do not want to have to be told to spend the money on those kinds of settings that make sure folks aren't institutionalized. So I think that's just like another like kind of smaller thing that like keeps getting missed, but it would be really bad for the progress we've made around deinstitutionalizing disabled people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a pretty recent example, right, is I don't know if it was last year or the year before, but the DOJ under the Biden administration successfully sued the state of Florida for pretty much forced institutionalization of disabled children.
Yep.
Because they didn't want to provide the money to allow at-home care for these kids to be able to be at homes with their families, with their communities, and receive the care that they needed. They just wanted to just toss them into institutions. And I mean, I'm sure that I haven't followed it since then, but I'm sure, Florida's going to appeal it. It's going to get tied up in litigation. But yeah, I mean, like, that's actively happening. Like that's one of the things I'm noticing about this current moment in time is that when, I'm queer and disabled. So when I talk about what's happening to the queer community, I'm not trans, but, I talk about what's happening to the trans community, advocate for the trans community, and folks are like, no, that's not happening. Or you talk about what's happening, they always want to combat and say, well, you're just talking about hypotheticals. It's like, no, this is literally happening. Like I can point to the lawsuit from a year or two ago that this is actually happening right now. And just to clarify, you mentioned the gender dysphoria part about the Section 504. So for listeners, one of the changes or one of the updates to Section 504 that happened under the Biden administration was that it clarified that gender dysphoria constitutes legitimate disability under Section 504 to require accommodations if you're receiving federal funding. And so, yes, this is couched in the anti-trans agenda and the trans erasure agenda, but as we've hopefully made clear by this point, it's going well beyond that. They're using it as just sort of a Trojan horse to try to kick out one of the foundational underpinnings of protections for the disabled community in the United States.
Yeah.
So, and we talked about Department of Education. So, clearly Section 504 isn't the only thing that's under attack. And I also talked about, I made allusions to this administration attacking from multiple directions. So right now, Congress is going through some stuff with talking about funding and budgets and keeping the government open. And one of the things Republicans want to push through would result in drastic cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, SNAP benefits, social welfare programs. Again, Project 2025, the thing they told us they weren't going to do. What sorts of impact would the drastic cuts to Medicaid, if not the outright dissolution of Medicaid, those programs, what sort of impact would that have on the disabled community?
Well, I mean, Medicaid serves like 1 in 5 people in the U.S. And I don't remember the exact number around which or how many of those folks are disabled, but the number's very high. So, like, one, it would take away healthcare from millions of people. Just blanket take away healthcare. If what they're proposing is $880 billion in cuts, and the Republicans will claim that it's not impacting Medicaid, it's not impacting Social Security, Medicare, anything like that. It is it wouldn't directly impact Medicare funding. It would absolutely, cutting Medicaid itself would impact Medicare, but it would, of course, again, completely take away healthcare for millions of people. It would impact many people's ability to get in-home care, home and community-based services, long-term services and supports that are directly funded Medicaid programs. So the fact that we have hundreds of thousands of people on waiting lists for certain Medicaid care waivers, that would just increase significantly. There would probably be no money to continue to fund. And then this is also, really important that I don't hear talked about a lot, but most of our state budgets rely on Medicaid dollars. And without Medicaid funding, I don't see a way that our states are our state budgets are not completely decimated. And what that means then is our states are going to have to cut a ton of funding from so many different programs that directly impact our community too. So this will, cutting Medicaid, of course, is going to first and foremost take away healthcare from so many people in our community who are just, who need healthcare. And then it's going to just have a downstream effect, and it will impact state budgets. It will impact statewide programs. We're just going to see this ripple effect of all of our programs, the things that ensure people have care. All these things are going to be defunded, cut significantly, and it's going to harm a lot of people. And unfortunately, I think people will die. People won't have healthcare, and they'll die. And I think that's this is another way to advance their eugenics agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, because there's a lot of like wordplay semantics, right? They say, oh no, we're not cutting Medicaid because we didn't write down cut Medicaid,
Yeah, right.
but the level of budgetary cut that they're mandating, the only way you can achieve that number is either through significant reductions, if not cutting it entirely.
Yeah.
And then you on top of that, we have Doge. Um, there's a lot I could say, but so
It's embarrassing to even like say it out loud. It's
I
just
know, I know. As somebody who's like old enough to remember like when like the Doge meme and like all
yeah.
that sort of stuff first came, I'm like, I can't believe this is where we're at right now. Um, but in addition to these sort of like mandated sort of cuts, also they talk about, like, well, we're going to send things back to the states. So they're going to send things back to the states, but then they're also going to like cut funding to the states. And so again, it's this like sort of nesting true intentions under careful wordplay. But in addition to like the budget cuts, there's also all of this sort of reductions in force, as they call it, but just slashing the federal workforce. And recently, so Doge has kind of made its way into the Social Security Administration at this point. And not too long ago, the former head of the SSA, Martin O'Malley, said that, he went on record, I forgot where he was being interviewed, and he said, yeah, he's like, with the level of workforce like reductions that they're doing, you know, within the next 30 to 90 days, like we're at serious risk of people not getting their benefits of this kind of imploding. And I think a lot of people think about Social Security in terms of retirement, but Social Security also covers sort of disability as well. Can you talk a little bit about that and the impact of what's happening in Social Security Administration right now, and on the disabled community now, and potential future impacts?
Yeah. So Social Security Administration administers supplemental security income SSI and Social Security disability income or insurance SSDI. Um, so like essentially it SSI provides income for folks who are disabled who don't have an income. Or are 65 and older. And it's, a very small amount of money, but it is a lifeline for people who otherwise do not have an income. Um, SSDI is insurance, like it's based on your work history. Um, so there's different restrictions and you have to different eligibility requirements, but essentially both of these programs are lifelines for disabled people at different income levels and different types of disabilities. And so it's the reduction in workforce is horrifying to think about. One, because like it's already, I think, waiting the wait time for any sort of like notice on whether you've gotten SSDI or SSI. It's like I think the average is like 7 months or something. So you're already waiting an enormously long amount of time. Cutting half the workforce, I don't there may have been a prediction on exactly how that would increase wait times, but I wouldn't be surprised if it doubles wait times. With not enough people working to process applications, like you're going to wait for an answer. And in 2023, 30,000 people died while waiting for disability benefits.
Yeah.
And that's just gonna we're gonna see that number increase tenfold if we reduce the workforce of SSA, because they're already like what's the underemployed or like
Yeah, understaffed.
understaffed. Thank you. Yeah, understaffed. Yeah, like they already don't have the staff to be able to keep up with the huge influx of applications for these programs. So yeah, it would take away income for folks who literally have no other means of bringing in money, and then it would lead to people dying. And they've been going after Social Security for forever. And I know there's been talks about privatizing Social Security, and I mean it's all a money making uh, scheme at the end of the day. But like disabled people are once again like acceptable collateral in this. So it'd be
Yeah, and in addition to the reduction in force thing too, they're also closing several field offices and also offices where they would conduct hearings. And the explanation from on high is just like, well, we're going to route people to, we're going to create a great online portal for people to do this, ignoring the fact that for some folks, for some elderly folks, they're not as technologically savvy. And so they need to be able to like contact people on the phone or go in person to do it. And also for some disabled folks, depending on what disability, or if the online portal or the phone system is even accessible, like has accessibility features built into it, their only option for filing claims or dealing with interfacing with the agency is in person. And they're also not just firing people, but also closing the physical spaces for people to be able to do that.
Mhm. Yep. And I think you may have just mentioned this, or you talked about it just now as part of what you were saying around closing offices. But I think I also saw that they're cutting the phone line completely, where you don't even have the option to call.
I missed that part. That must be, I missed that. Yeah. So completely just severing the ability for anybody, not taking into I mean, probably taking into consideration the type of people who need this service and just making sure they can't access it. So that way they can not have to, part of it is not having to pay out stuff. And then part of it is them being able to point to it as not working. So they have an excuse to privatize it. So
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I just fact checked myself. They are scrapping a bunch of pieces of the phone services. So, like you can't do direct deposit changes by phone. Like there's a number of things that they're cutting, and it will probably lead to them cutting the phone services altogether. So it's either online or going in person.
yeah, going in person to now half
Right.
the places don't exist anymore.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, all right. So I don't want to end on like all of this super depressing stuff. So what can or should folks be doing right now? So how can they fight back? And we know this is going to be a long fight. So how can folks best prepare their communities to make it through what's happening right now while we continue to fight?
Yeah, so to also keep it fair and bipartisan, our opposition party is not doing a great job
What
of
opposition party?
yeah, right, exactly, what opposition party. So yeah, I think like call your reps, call your senators, like I think that still has an impact. I know from folks on the Hill that, when they get calls, inundated with constituent calls, it 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 still moves them. Like they still want to stay elected. That's important to them. So I think that calling and saying we don't want cuts to Medicaid, you know, call your senators today, make sure they don't vote on the continuing resolution. Like I know this is not coming out today, so who knows what's going to happen after today?
Right.
It's Friday the 14th. But that works and as of now, you can still call your elected representatives and get them to do the right thing or try to. I just also think that like we're in a moment where we have to be um, bold and um, courageous and uh, not comply with not pre-comply with fascism, not comply with fascism. Like, and I've seen a lot of grassroots organizing happening, especially since the 504 lawsuit became like public knowledge and kind of went viral. So more of that, like find a political home, like find the folks who are doing the organizing, and go out to a rally, or if you can't if you can't go out physically to a rally, like there's plenty of stuff organizing happening online that's just as valid as being somewhere in person. Bringing other disabled folks and their families and allies into this fight. I think like use your platforms if you have them, and write letters to the editor. Like just there are so many things that we can do to like keep disability issues in the forefront of folks' minds who are not impacted or don't think they're impacted, because we need everybody to be mobilized and aware in this moment. So I think, like, of course, contacting your reps, but I think even more than that, it's like, keep talking about it, keep finding ways to plug in and organize. That's how we're going to be able to at least make some of the bad a little less bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like how you said, even if you think it doesn't impact you, like we need you to mobilize. We don't like to talk about disability or the potential to become disabled either permanently or temporarily, but chronic illnesses, disease, like things happen that you can't account for and you can't anticipate, and so you may not think this impacts you until suddenly it does.
That's right.
And I wanted to name too that a lot of what we talked about were things that are happening with the federal levels, like funding that comes from the federal level. Is there a space for local and state politics and organizing at the local and state level that can help to mitigate some of the harms that are happening now or that we're seeing on the horizon?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think um, uh, if things go the way that the Trump administration wants them to go, a lot of things will be left up to the states. And there is, I think, an opportunity now to invest time and energy into like talking to your state reps and state senators and your governor's office and attorney general and secretary of state. Like those are important positions, and I think so much of the news cycle is like overwhelmed by national politics and federal government, but the state and local level is just as, if not more important in ways, because it impacts a lot of our lives even more directly. So I think the organizing and the advocacy and meeting with your legislators like that, I think is really critical to do at the state level. Not only just to potentially prepare for, should these things happen at the federal level, to have some folks on our side when things are, handed down to the state. But I also think, governor's offices, especially if you live in like a red state, like governor's offices, secretary of state, AG, like those folks have relationships with folks in Congress and DC and the White House, and I think like those relationships also there can be influence there at that level as well. So I think it doesn't just have to be our members in Congress in DC. What happens at the state level can have an influence at the federal level. So I think it's just as valid, if not in ways more important.
Awesome. And before I let you go, if folks want to learn more about you, your work, New Disabled South, where can they find you?
NewDisabledSouth.org is our website, and at New Disabled South, I think, is the handle for most of the things. And then I'm on Instagram at _tattoo Jew, and I'm on the other platforms as like I think just at the Tattoo Jew.
Awesome, and we'll include links to stuff in the show notes too. Yeah, so thank you so much for taking some time out of your day today to talk about all of these attacks, but also things that we can be doing and to maybe provide information to folks. I know one of the things that I've seen a lot in the last, I don't know, it hasn't even been 2 months since they took office.
Nope.
Has just been folks expressing a lot of surprise over being like, well, I didn't know X fell under, DEI or what have you, especially when it comes to sort of like K through 12 accommodations or certain things like that. So I think a lot of folks are realizing uh, some stuff that they took for granted and not really understanding the types of things that are really in danger or really being targeted. So conversations like this, I think, are really important. So I really thank you for taking your time to kind of provide your perspective and help to kind of in plain language explain what's going on to folks. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.